My name is Mark Schmidt. I'm a senior fellow here, and I'm going to moderate this discussion. I'm going to moderate it as lightly as possible. I'm a low-impact moderator, so I won't make any profound statements of my own opinion on these issues. We're very pleased to have here today Gregory Rodriguez, who is the director of our California Fellows Program, which is almost the California, which is in California, and the California dimension of the New America Foundation is in some ways rivals the Washington dimension of it. Certainly rivals it for effectiveness in kind of getting things enacted into law and or at least introduced in California. He's also the one of the Irvine Senior Fellows himself in the California program, and for as long as I've been here, I've been hearing about and looking forward to his book on Mexican immigration and identity in the United States and in California. Gregory's written very widely on issues of national identity, of social cohesion, assimilation, race relations, immigration, ethnicity. He's published in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Economist, and the Washington Post, and he's a regular op-ed columnist in the Los Angeles Times, which I think is one of the more interesting op-ed pages in this country. He was listed by Esquire magazine as among the best and brightest Americans who will revolutionize the way we think. So prepare to be revolutionized. And today he's going to discuss his new book, which is called Mongrels, Bastards, Orphans, and Vagabonds: Mexican Immigration and the Future of Race in America. It's a really I haven't read all of it yet. I've read some of it, but it's a fascinating look at the ways in which Mexican identity has varied over the course of history, and really goes well beyond the current debates about immigration and identity to get very deep into these issues, and he's got a unique perspective. We'll take questions after he makes a brief introduction to, or 20 minutes or so introduction to his the book, and we have books available for sale outside, and we hope you'll want to purchase one. Thanks again for coming.
Thanks very much, everyone, for coming. Appreciate it. I think I'm addicted to this, actually, so I'll put it away. I wrote a book, and essentially it's a history hidden in an argument. But I'll tell you the argument, and hopefully you'll read the history later, because there are books for sale. And the essential, what I've done is look at what has become the largest immigrant group in American history through a non-polemical. I'm not taking a side on the issue here. I'm trying to understand what has essentially become the largest immigrant group in American history, which we can't talk about without getting involved in a debate whether they should be here or not, or whether the new people should be here or not. Mexican Americans have been around for a long time. There's plenty of precedent. We know how they've acculturated over time, but yet it gets lost in divisive and polarizing debates. I start in 1519. Others have debated when Mexican American history started. Was it 1848, the end of the Mexican-American War? At that time, 75 to 1,000 Mexicans remained in the territory that was first conquered and territory that was then annexed. And if they stayed a year after the treaty was signed, they were eligible for U.S. citizenship. And those were the first Mexican-Americans came. And then, or does it start in 1910 when the big vast wave came during the Revolution? I argue it started in 1519. That it started with the birth of the Mexican people, and that's where I'm going to start. Mexico, as far as I can tell, has a rather pathological ethnic origin myth. It's one that has not served it well, and it hasn't survived fully its ethnic origin myth. And that is of its male progenitor, Hernán Cortés, the conqueror, sleeping with his mistress and his translator, Doña Marina or La Malinche, and it's a myth that's born of tragedy. It was their child, Martín Cortés, who was psychically the first mestizo, and this is something that Mexico still hasn't grappled with fully. That when Mexico became an independent nation in the early 19th century, it essentially had turned both of those iconic figures into bad people. Doña Marina became the whore, the betrayer. She betrayed her indigenous peoples in helping the Spaniards conquer an indigenous land. And of course, Cortés was one of the horrible Spanish conquerors who came. So Mexico, in a sense, became what Octavio Paz called orphans. They were both detached from both sides of their heritage, the Spanish and the indigenous. Over time, Mexico clearly, politically heralded its Indian ancestry, but in practice and in social life, really revered whiteness as a status symbol. And the light, you can, turn on Univision any night of the week, and we can see that. So Mexico hasn't really done very well at grappling with its mestizaje, with its mixture, its racial and cultural synthesis. But there's another. But I proposed recently in the Los Angeles Times a new sort of genesis myth for Mexico, and particularly for Mexican Americans, and as a way to look at this tragic origins from a conquest into one of possibilities, and that is straight out of the Conquest of New Spain by Bernal Díaz del Castillo. And very early on in the book, he describes when Cortés's men reached Cozumel in 1519, a friendly band of Mayan Indians, and Lord knows how they communicated this, told them that there were 2 Christians captive in the neighboring land of Yucatan. Now, Cortés asked the Mayan chieftain they were speaking to send some men to go rescue them. The man said, no, I'm not going to do that. They'll get killed. And undeterred, Cortés sent his own men. He sent them with trinkets to trade for their release if they were presumably captives, and with a letter hidden in one of the Spaniards' beards. And they got to the first man, Jerónimo de Aguilar, who had been imprisoned since he and another man were shipwrecked in 1511. This was 8 years prior. And they found him in a state, as I said, he was captive. He sought very hard to keep his Spanishness. He prayed every day and marked a calendar. But yet, by the 8 years, by the time the Spaniards found him, he thought it was Wednesday, but it was really a Sunday. And he was beginning to slip away from reality. The Spaniards gave trinkets to his captor, and he was released happily. He went on. He actually became a translator because he spoke Mayan by that point and helped Cortés in some of the early parts of the conquest. They went on afterwards for the second man. His name was Gonzalo Guerrero, and he was living 15 miles away in a very different situation. They found him, and he was married to a daughter of a Mayan chieftain. He was the captain in times of war, and he had thoroughly sort of assimilated into that Mayan tribe. The Spaniards found him with tattoos, with an earring, and they came to him and said, come back with us to civilization. And much to the surprise of his would-be liberators, he said, no, look at me. I'm not one of you anymore. You wouldn't accept me. The Spaniards would never accept me again. And they really concerned his would-be liberators. They didn't understand, and suddenly the man's wife, his Mayan wife, started screaming, who are these savages coming here talking this savage language? And then finally, Guerrero just puts his foot down and says precisely why he can't go back to civilization. And he said, but look at my children, his Mayan Spanish children, but look at my children, how beautiful they are. Look at my children, que bonitos son. That is the first documentation of the first mestizo Mexicans. Now, of course, that's a psychic arena, and ethnic origins and ethnic origin myths and national myths are very important. I mean, here in the United States, we've elevated Thanksgiving to our national myth. Clearly, we know that wasn't history, that Anglo settlers didn't always sit down and have nice dinners with Indians. But as Joseph Campbell said, we need these myths because they're not just history, they're sense of possibilities for us in the future, a sense of healing the bad things that did happen in history. What happened as the Spaniards did further their conquest was they set up, once the conquest was over, they set up a strict regime of segregation. The Spaniards thought of the system that was a bifurcated system that would have 2 repúblicas, a República de los Españoles and a República de los Indios, and they were not to mix. The Crown wanted this because clearly the Spanish minority was surrounded by an indigenous majority country, and to remain separate is similar to the Delta of Mississippi or any place where African Americans were a majority. The white minority hunkered down and tried to remain separate out of protection. The church had another reason to segregate races, and that was to, according to them, to protect the Indians from bad Spanish influences. So Spain kept this rigid order But from the very first moment, it began to erode. But it took centuries for them to realize that it had eroded. The first mestizos, other than the story I just told you, were largely of products of rape, sometimes presumably of attraction, sometimes presumably of love, sometimes of one-night stands of the victor and those who those who had lost. And the status of that mixed child tended not to be, they weren't acknowledged as mestizo. They were either brought into the Spanish fold. The daughter of, the son of Hernan Cortés and La Malinche was legitimized. Martín Cortés became a Spanish aristocrat, probably a brown-skinned Spanish aristocrat in the 16th century. But other less fortunate and perhaps products of more illicit, secret, quick unions, if you will, were relegated to the indigenous communities. And they were half, and they were bastards, and they didn't belong, and the Indians didn't treat them terribly well. So by 1530, the word mestizo was synonymous with bastard. That this was largely, the first mestizos in colonial Spain were largely children of illegitimate unions, or rather illegitimate children of illicit unions. Over time, the Spaniards, again, still kept to that fiction, and this group didn't fit into the legal system. And to the extent that sometimes, again, I'm trying to explain my title here, they became vagabonds on some sense. They didn't belong in the central towns that the Spanish inhabited, nor did they belong in indigenous cities. And they were sort of essential outcasts. And the book's title refers to interstitial, intermediate categories that don't belong in rigid racial systems. There was a third power in colonial New Spain which actually didn't want segregation, and that was that of the encomenderos, the gentlemen, the conquerors who had been granted large tracts of land by the crown and large numbers of Indians to work that land for them. And it was in their best interest for the Indians to be close. And on some level, that's what brought the races together, was economics, was the need for labor, was the Spanish, and this undermined both the wishes of the crown and the church. And one great late scholar, Woodrow Borah, at Berkeley, a scholar of colonial Mexico, once wrote that the mestizo, the Mexican mixed mestizo, was a product of debt peonage. That essentially it was the economic forces that brought people together, because otherwise they were supposedly to have remained apart. Over time, the fiction of the separation began to erode. Another scholar of the colonial era wrote about what's so interesting about studying the mestizo in colonial New Spain is that they didn't exist. There was nary a record of them. There were people who didn't belong. Later on in the later colonial era, as the mixing was rampant and couldn't be controlled, we see that the Spanish elite and the criollo, the Mexican-born Spanish elite, became very concerned about their own sense of purity, their own whiteness. And they sort of enacted some new regime to try to make sense and control the mixture that was happening. And they borrowed a term used in the Inquisition in Spain, limpieza de sangre, cleanliness of blood, that people in Spain had to prove that they didn't have Muslim or Jewish blood. But in the New World, it was a racial determinant. And limpieza de sangre meant that you were for elite of Spanish descent, you had to prove that you didn't have indigenous or black blood. The caste system then, the Caste System, was then sort of not so much implemented as it was fantasized. With all the mixing, the Spanish elite, again, very concerned about the mixing going on and the fact that it was getting a little darker itself over time, created this fiction of the Caste System. You've seen these paintings, perhaps, traveling around the United States, and some of these beautiful, it's a series of paintings, sometimes with 16 parts, in which there's sort of a perverse family portrait. You have the race of the father listed, the race of the mother listed, and the race of the child listed. And it was essentially a hierarchical listing on one level, and it was a sort of a cautionary tale on the other. So you know that the higher you were the more white blood, the more Spanish blood you could claim, the higher you were in the hierarchy. And the closer, the more African or indigenous blood, the lower you got. So it was clear that presumably they were to be teaching people that if they were of mestizo, mixed indigenous and Spanish, that it would behoove them to marry perhaps a castizo, which was really the product of a Spanish and a mestizo, than it would to marry a mulatto. But for a while, American historians in particular thought, wow, this is Mexican society was so fantastically organized that they had everybody down, but it was a fiction. It was a fantasy. That the society was eroding and mixing underneath all these categories. You can look at legal records from 17th century Mexico, and in a court case, in one single court case, a person can be described as 3 different races. Now, as the Spaniards moved north, this system eroded even further and faster. The further you got away from the crown and the church authority in the Valley of Mexico, the more you could play with that racial messiness. And the people who did go north were not, presumably, it makes sense, were not those who had high status in New Spanish society. They were not the white-skinned, they were not the European, they were not the Spaniards. They tended to be people of mestizo or mulatto origin. You look at the first pobladores of the city of Los Angeles, over half were of African ancestry. So once the new settlers got to places like San Antonio and Los Angeles, race became even a messier category. And we can see the first census of the city of Los Angeles, that between 1781 and 1789, the number of people who switched their racial categories over that 8-year period is remarkable. A certain Jose Vanegas, 1781, listed himself as Indian. By 1789, he was mestizo. Maybe he had a little bit more money. He claimed a new racial status. And after a while, biological racial determinants, the determinant of one's racial status became more socially determined than biologically determined. Now this system, as it was eroding and going north, then hit another system. It hit the Anglo-American racial system, which was moving west, and essentially was premised on the notion of purity, and it was premised on the bifurcation between black and white. And it never clearly knew what to do with Mexicans, and it still doesn't. But before I go on to that, I'm arguing on some level that a mestizo mentality emerged in the colonial New Spain. And I referred to historian Charles Gibson labeled the colonial mestizo a pragmatic opportunist. The anthropologist Eric Wolf, a great American anthropologist at the University of Chicago, described the colonial mestizo as this: the mestizo's chances of survival lay neither in accumulating cultural furniture nor in cleaving to cultural norms, but in an ability to change, to adapt, to improvise. The ever-shifting nature of his social condition forced him to move with guile and speed through the hidden passageways of society, not to commit himself to any one position or to any one spot. And indeed, even as the mestizos began to be acknowledged as existing, they were not of one society. They did not have a mestizo neighborhood. There was not mestizo guilds. The individual mestizos sought to fit into society where they could, presumably based on whatever status they had, presumably their skin color, presumably their gender, presumably their parentage. But the mestizo itself became that person who didn't belong in a strict system and then therefore try to find his or her place within whatever system existed. As the Anglo-Americans moved west, early on, Mexicans became de facto white, according to the census, which when they collected figures. And not only for that, in part because to be white meant you weren't black at that point, and I don't know if it's changed any. But there's another aspect. Because of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, which again conferred citizenship on those who remained in the territory after 1 year, only white people could become citizens of the United States in the mid-19th century. So if Mexicans had been were eligible for citizenship, then they presumably were white people. So there was that legal, sort of federal recognition aspect, and then there was the social aspect. Socially, they weren't considered white people. In 1850 to 1920, de facto whites. In 1930, what you had was an attempt by nativists out of California to reclassify Mexicans out of the white category, because they were seizing on a law in 1924 that made it illegal for anyone to enter the United States who was not eligible to become a citizen. And at that point, only white and black people, because of an amendment to the Constitution, could become citizens of the United States. So the effort was to make Mexican a racial category. So people who were born in 1930, let's say like my father, in Los Angeles County, it says race, it says Mexican. There's another side story. There's a similar. The city of El Paso, which tried to turn itself into a spa and health resort, which is kind of a funny thought, sought to reclassify Mexicans out of a white category in order to improve its health statistics. Mexican-American advocates then responded. And what this did was it created the first sort of Mexican-American advocacy strategy, which was some have called the other white race strategy. That in essence, if rights were conferred by the extent to which one can claim whiteness, you claim whiteness. The U.S. Postal Service recently honored a famous Mexican-American civil rights case, Mendez versus Westminster in California, early 1950s, I believe. I might be wrong. 1947, thank you. I knew I was wrong. And Mendez versus Westminster is interesting because the effort was not to, the Mexican-American advocates were not attempting to say segregation was wrong overall. They were attempting to say it just doesn't apply to us. So this strategy had presumably some successes, but overall, over time, didn't really work. The famous case, which you probably know, in Texas, in which a Mexican-American was convicted of murder, and the judge, the lawyer protested to the judge that it was not a jury of his peers, and the judge said, well, Mexicans are white, and it's an all-white jury, so what's your problem? So over time, the strategy needed to change, and it did change with the advent of the African-American civil rights movement and the strategies that were based on Brown versus Board of Education. And for a while, Mexican Americans were sort of balancing, advocates, groups, were balancing this need to be acknowledged as a distinct minority in order to benefit from these new solutions without losing their whiteness. And it was a sort of but with the advent of race-based strategies such as affirmative action or the Voting Rights Act, there became an incentive then to claim non-whiteness. So literally, within a course of 10 years, you would have Mexican-American advocates go from claiming whiteness to claiming non-whiteness. So we have a system that didn't know what to do with them, and Mexican-American advocates who, understandably, tried to game the system on either side to see what was most beneficial. I argue this is partly our history. And I've had, I wrote this in the Christian Science Monitor recently, this similar concept, and someone wrote me and he simply said, I won't repeat the word, he called me. And I'm not saying this is bad. I'm saying this racial categorization system is absurd. And I think it's kind of cool that people sought to get around it any way they could. And they weren't abiding by the strict imposition of these categories. It was simply trying to make best of whatever category they could claim at the time. Now, for the last 40 years, we've seen all sorts of shifts in the way Mexican Americans have looked at themselves racially, clearly. As of 1980, the census allowed all Hispanics to choose, well, we know the little fine line, right? Hispanics can be of any race. And as Bill Fry, the demographer here, knows better than anyone, that's been a source of concern to the Census Bureau. In 1980, when the first numbers came back, some colleagues of mine were in some of these meetings, the Census Bureau looked at the Mexican-American data from California and essentially saw that about half of Mexican-Americans in California claim white. Because remember, in the census, there's the ethnic question, there's are you Hispanic, are you not Hispanic, and then there's a racial question, the discrete categories. And the other half said other. And this was a concern. In 1990, the numbers remained pretty constant. In 2000, it happened again. And I believe even now, after the last census, there's been some talk of getting rid of the other category. So as people like Mexican Americans and other Latino Americans who put other would be forced to pick one of the discrete categories of race. Now, what I argue is that if you have a discrete system of A, B, C, and D, a system of discrete categories, rather, and suddenly millions of people put E, none of the above, it not only erodes the validity of the whole system, it erodes the validity of each discrete category. And this is my essential argument in the book, and this is my short version of the book. in that Mexican Americans have never fit into the American racial system and will erode it and undermine it. As I was finishing the book, I found something. This is just it was fantastic. I didn't know, and I realized that one of the most critical testimonies to the House subcommittee that oversees the census was from a man named Carlos Fernandez. I never met the gentleman. He's a Berkeley activist. Father was Mexican, his mother was Anglo-American, and he had studied the history of Mexico and studied how Mexico had grappled with its mixture, its mestizaje, the challenges of it, the benefits of it, and his testimony essentially was critical in leading the U.S. government to allow Americans to choose more than one race in the 2000 census. So that, coupled with other Mexican-American intellectuals, Richard Rodriguez, John Philip Santos, these are people who have resurrected have taken what was a nasty word, miscegenation, what was essentially this notion of race mixture was a nasty idea, and have replaced the term with mestizo and mestizaje, using the Spanish word. You can see the word mestizaje in the Los Angeles Times without a clause defining it anymore. And they're bringing a new sensibility about this change. Now, Mexicans aren't creating the mixture of America. This is happening. America is mixing. But they're hastening that mixture. In California, the most populous state of the Union, the largest immigrant population in the Union, the largest Mexican origin population in the Union, 2/3 of interethnic, interracial unions involve a Latino partner. Secondly, not only hastening, they're bringing, again, this language, this history, this conceptualization. Again, Mexico hasn't figured it out. But at the very least, Mexican intellectuals and Mexican-American intellectuals have been grappling with this mixture. And they bring with it a terminology and a history and a sensibility. Because overall, the colonial history of Mexico presented a rigid racial system that collided with actual rampant mixture, which created a sense of the malleability of race and culture. And I believe this has survived the colonial period, and this has survived and was brought northward as Mexicans come. And I believe, again, over time, Mexican immigration will change the way we view race in America before too long. And I hope I'm within time. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gregory. I'm going to ask the first. I'll stand and call on people, and you stand, and we'll both stand. But I want to ask the first question, which is a very East Coast perspective on what I think is
What's a
little bit. Yeah, right. I fully admit that I went to school with lots of people who were Hispanic and so forth, and it wasn't until I was about 20 years old that I understood that Puerto Rican and Dominican were not the only categories of Hispanic. So I have a very East Coast perspective. I think the question always in a place like New York, for example, is which puts a particular pressure on the racial identity of mostly non-Mexican Latinos, is which is pre-Brown versus Board and so forth, is can you build a Black Latino political alliance for power, and then African Americans have a certain stake in the racial identity. Because it allows you to build that, because of the belief that allows you to build that coalition, and it kind of brings up the classic line one hears is, are Latinos going to be more like white ethnics, or are they going to be more like African Americans? And I wonder if you can just put the lens of identity the history you've built, and put it on that political question, either in L.A.
Well,
or
I'm not
Chicago.
going to ignore your political question and say that essentially. And I didn't say this, and I should have said this in the talk. After choosing either side of the racial divide, I think there's a point right now where Mexican Americans, the numbers and the level of cultural confidence in the places in the Southwest and the growing political confidence is leading people to believe that they don't need to play either side. There's a sense of our own coming into our own selves, in a sense, and sort of declaring our brownness, declaring that otherness. So I think part of this book is, again, I don't think we should see Mexicans as, it's the largest immigrant in the history of the United States. See them as Mexicans. Understand that Mexicans, don't try to say, are they whites or are they blacks? They're Mexicans. They're a large group to deserve to be understood on their own terms and not as an analogy. And so I'm arguing that we've sort of outlived the analogies, and we're big enough and important enough to be understood in our own terms and within the context of our own history. So there.
All right. Yes, right by the camera.
Too many people complain. I'm a reporter from Mexico, and I would like to know that too many people complain in the U.S. that Mexican population do not integrate easily to the mainstream. What do you think is going to be the main challenge for this community to integrate and be assimilated by this culture? And what do you think the governments can do in Mexico and U.S. to help them to integrate? And I would like to know also if you can answer in Spanish. This perfect.
I'd rather do it in English for the audience.
Maybe you can do
afterwards, perhaps. Afterward? My two things. Mexican government can't do much about that, but I'll answer that first. Vicente Fox did a great thing, I think, in about a month before he took office. And he gave a speech in Los Angeles to the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. And for the first time, he sort of acknowledged, again, in the U.S., acknowledged Mexican Americans, acknowledged migrants. Migrants, for the longest time, were just simply emblems of how mismanaged Mexico was and how poorly. I mean, essentially, when you have millions of people leaving your country, it's not a great vote of confidence. And Mexico has never treated Mexican Americans all terribly that well. We were pochos, we were watered down Mexicans who sold our souls, sold our culture for money, and we were symbols of betrayal, if you will. What Fox did, and he began to do it when he was running for office, is to talk about migrants as heroes. And then when he came to Los Angeles at that time, he actually said, we want Mexicans to dream the American dream, those who remain here, and we want them to become good Americans, but not to forget us and send us money once in a while. And that's a step up on one level from the Mexican government to acknowledge that. Secondly, the history of Mexican enculturation is pretty well documented. It's not heard a lot. Mexican Americans have managed not to turn. I mean, part of our problem with assimilation has become a bad word because in a part we misunderstand it. We misunderstand it as a pure linear process of loss and ethnic obliteration, and it's never really been that. It's always been a little bit more complicated than that. It's always been right. I mean, I was in Chicago last night, and some gentleman actually said, "Well, when previous immigrants came, they stopped speaking their language as soon as they got here." And I said, "They did?" So some of it's fantasy, some of it's the fact. Some of it is sort of the multicultural era got us to believe that, I mean, multicultural in a sense emphasizes the continuity among a family. So in a sense, it means that the grandchild of a Japanese American is closer to his grandmother in culture than he is to his 10-year-old Polish American playmate next door. To some sense, we're living in that sort of fantasy. No, culture is a little bit more complicated and nuanced and changing than that. But multicultural has a sense, for all its benefits, and we can get into that later, has led us to believe in that talk about culture as if it were the way we talked about race, that it was somehow unchangeable and permanent, that it was set in stone. Number one, are you referring to undocumented immigrants or legal immigrants when you say acceptance and over time?
I refer to everybody. I also would like to ask you, do you think the future of about 12 million illegal immigrants is going to be to become U.S. citizens and maybe...
I'm not terribly hopeful about that, but that's another subject entirely. Should I still answer that other question? Oh, next question.
Yes, on the aisle.
Yes,
And please identify yourself, and also please make sure you actually ask a question rather than a speech.
I'm Salim Ali. I'm a professor at the University of Vermont. I'm originally from Pakistan, and what's interesting for me is comparing the immigration from South Asia to the Gulf states, where identity is assumed in both cases that they're not going to lose their identity, they're not going to assimilate, they're economic migrants. Mm-hmm. They're going to go back, and in the case of Dubai, the majority of the population is now non-Emirati, of course, but overwhelmingly so. And I'm wondering how that would relate to potentially like a guest worker program or something like that. Could that be a model which we could...
I'm more concerned with integration, but let me get to that, what you just said. That was essentially the problem that Mexicans had for so long a time, which was the many Mexicans came with the idea of living here for a short time, making money and going back. Over time, many didn't go back. And so what happened was Mexicans had historically had the lowest naturalization rates of any immigrant group. But the second lowest is Canadians. So it leads one to believe that it's about proximity to the nation, to the homeland. And it's about the idea that one can go back. And what happened over time, that those who didn't go back said, I'll retire home, I'll go back to Mexico. And they didn't. And what that did, it was bad for the immigrants themselves. And we're talking about legal immigrants at this point. It was bad for the immigrant community itself, and it was bad for the body politic as a whole. These people were not participating. They were sort of putting down a root. They were having children who were Americans, but they weren't Americanizing in the civic sense. Proposition 187 really changed that in California, the Anti-Illegal Immigrant Ballot Initiative. And what it did was create this, we all know the story, this enormous backlash in which it led to the biggest rush to naturalization in the history of the United States, which was spearheaded by Mexicans in the mid-1990s. And it changed this whole culture of being on the fence. On the night of 187, I went to the most Mexican place in Los Angeles, Huntington Park, on the corner of Florence and Pacific Boulevard, the Gallo Quito restaurant, 24 hours. And people were crying. It was like a kick in the stomach. But there was this sense like, God, as bad as it is here with Pete Wilson, it beats my little pueblo in Michoacan. And that pushed people off the fence to naturalize, to register, to vote, and it increased civic integration over time. But what the failure over time previously of Mexicans to integrate because they thought they might go back actually burdened the children. And I argue that it made them accidental Americans. Like if your parents didn't prepare you for your national identity and say you're American, then the children, the second generation, had the entire burden. They were Americans. And they had to deal with it themselves. And it wasn't really fair. So with the good news about people demanding to be citizens, I think that's good news, and I hope they do become citizens, is that it's preparing and changing the civic culture of Mexican immigrants. This notion that you can come and pretend that you're just going to come for a short time wasn't good for anybody. And it actually led to greater exploitation of them. It led them not to create unions. Why? You're going to go back. Right? It led to this great sense of impermanence, which only allowed their employers to exploit them more.
Yes, you.
Oh, I know you. I recognize your face.
Can you talk a little bit more about second generation or the children of immigrants and identity?
Mm-hmm.
We see this big demographic change happening across the country where people under a certain age, at a certain point in time are going to be entirely non-white or some kind of mixed heritage. And, we got into the census question a little bit about people picking off boxes, and we see, people under a certain age are more likely to check off more than one race,
Right.
to have parents who are
Right.
immigrant. And so I just want to hear more about where you went with that growing group in this country and what it means for them to maintain this identity, to move into a different one.
Well, I mean, I don't think I got anything you don't know. I think in places like California, what's happening is that you're identifying it, but the media is not identifying it, and the political infrastructure is not identifying it. You see what I mean? This mixture doesn't end up on the pages of the New York Times, because a Latino is a Latino is a Latino. I mean, the great correction of the New York Times last year, it was an article on Schwarzenegger and Villaraigosa, and they called them both immigrants, and then the little correction was, Mr. Villaraigosa was born in the United States. So the nuances are not shown. The Latino city council president of the city of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, is Mexican, Italian, Jewish. But so we have to catch up in a sense. All I can say is you know it, but the media doesn't know it because, and to a certain extent, some people are threatened by this. We know that people who are picked more than one race, were for purposes of civil rights monitoring, were often reclassified into one of the races, right? And we're going to see, I think we're going to go through a decade or two of fighting over what you two find, this mixture, and whether we're willing to really acknowledge it, because it seems to be threatening, and you know who they are, it seems to be threatening some vested interest to talk about mixture.
I guess I was more thinking about from people's point of view rather than...
I couldn't tell you.
No.
No. I thought you were going to let me off on that, Andrea.
No.
Yes.
Bob Rosenblatt, freelance writer. When there are lots of stories written about Rudy Giuliani, but I haven't seen one which says that he would become, if elected, the first Italian-American president.
I have.
You have?
There was one article about MSNBC had whether he was white enough to be president. Did you see that?
And I've talked to some good lunch buddies of mine who are Italian, and none of them think Giuliani being Italian doesn't seem to mean anything to them. Do you think, let's say, in 50 years, if somebody named Rodriguez is running for president, will that be perceived as will it be significant, or is it just that after 3 generations, everybody's American?
Here's the problem.
What about Bill Richardson?
Right.
You already got one running for president.
Here's the problem. Most migrations have beginning, middles, and ends. And there's a point at which you can talk about Norwegian Americans now being a preponderance of whom are now U.S. born and speaking more English than Norwegian. With Mexicans, it's a continuous migration. And so at any given time in the Mexican American population, there are people living at varying distances from the immigrant experiences and varying levels of acculturation. And what this does, it makes Mexican American acculturation, it still happens, but it isn't often acknowledged, and it complicates our acculturation. Because suddenly we are surrounded and we're living next door, we're working with somebody from the homeland. And what that does often is, and it increases the sense of our own foreignness. We could be here. It happens all the time. It's fun. I'm a suburban American boy, and I get that. Are you an immigrant? Did you come illegally? So we have a sort of a permanent sense of foreignness that immigrants sort of create. So because people can't, allow for distinctions, I don't know what. And again, it's the use of the term Latino, which has its purposes, but sometimes it obliterates important distinctions. You see what I mean? California voters, 80% of whom are of Mexican origin, don't give a damn that Mel Martinez quit the RNC. He's Cuban American from Florida. But the editors of the LA Times don't know that. You see what I mean? So we have to disaggregate to make sense of this population. Otherwise, it's really highly misunderstood because of that. So what I'm saying is that the constant replenishment of the new immigrants complicates Mexican American identity. It doesn't keep us from acculturating over time, but it often keeps people from accepting us as Americans.
Yes. You made a comment earlier that
Can you say who you are?
George Keyes. You made a comment earlier that something about identity was formed by perhaps proximity to the border. That somehow the Canadians and the Mexicans shared some ambivalence.
Or the unwillingness to
duality.
naturalize. Right.
Okay. What would you say about Mexicans in relation to Central American immigrants? Do they have the same cultural baggage of the mestizo identity, the relation to a Creole society? Are they bringing that same psychological makeup? Or would you look at them as a different population?
I couldn't really tell you because I wrote about Mexicans. That they're 2/3 of all Latinos. They're almost 90% of Latinos in California. I presumably they do have some of that. But the Mexican population, remember, the Central American population really began heavily migrate in the 80s. The distinct part of the Mexican immigration is that it's not only were the first Mexican Americans not migrants, but it's a recent big arrival, and it's an old immigrant group as well. So Central Americans don't quite have the same roots in the United States as Mexicans do. There's not exactly the precedent to look to them over time. We do know that they set up an established infrastructure very quickly. Salvadoran Americans in Los Angeles, but they established their own infrastructure, and they really resent it when you assume that they're Mexican.
Oh yeah.
If you take nothing else from this talk, Mike Calabrese.
Yeah. Hey.
Mike Calabrese, New America Foundation, grants on the book.
Thanks.
I hope this isn't a dumb question, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about whether, and I suppose you could probably speak most confidently from a California perspective, but do the folks you're talking about have a kind of a dual identity? Like, for example, I'm wondering which is stronger, or are they making both, like an identity to a particular country, like Mexico, and at the same time this kind of general sense of being, quote, Hispanic. One reason I ask that, because I'm also curious, years ago when I did employment law, in Los Angeles near Huntington Park, for example, the activists, if I ever used the word, made the mistake of using the word Hispanic, they jumped down my throat. That they considered that almost derogatory. So we're Latino. That's an Anglo construct. This idea of Hispanic.
They're all generic.
So
they're both generic terms.
So I'm just wondering, how does that sort out these days, both in terms of the identity and the terminology between the
terminology I don't get to.
Ethnicity and the general category.
Okay, the terminology I could care less about. I mean, if you're in Florida, you say Hispanic. If you're in, people still say Mexican American in Texas. You hear Hispanic and Latino in Texas, and Latino is preferred in California. So I don't take it as a big giant issue.
Is the word Chicano gone?
Let me answer that question first.
Sorry.
But to answer your question, there's no fixed identity. Again, at any given time, in this group of millions of people, there's different people living at varying distances from the immigrant experience and varying levels of acculturation. It's complicated, but it's not rocket science. If you're born here, you probably call yourself an American, because particularly if your parents ever took you back to the rancho and the toilets don't flush. Okay. There's plenty of those stories, particularly if you go back to Mexico. There is this jarring experience like, hey, I'm an American. But it depends. If you've been here for 3 days, you're not going to see you call yourself an American. If you're undocumented, you're not going to call yourself an American. It depends on, you can't understand, the identity, again, it's so fluid, and time does matter. And if you're a third generation Mexican American, I can't imagine you're not sophisticated enough to know that Mexican's your ethnic identity and American's your civic identity. It's not that different than other hyphenated American groups. But if you're an immigrant, it depends. You can see households, I did a lot of reporting after 187 and after the big rush to naturalization, those households of Mexicans who had once been undocumented and they were legalized with IRCA in 86, those households, they were like zealots. They were Americans, and it changed the civic culture of the household, right? I mean, I knew friends who, you go to their houses, and their dad had an American flag that was given to him in the naturalization ceremony. So again, it depends on the level of acculturation over time. But there's not one, and that's again this notion that we're looking for the Latino. We're looking for the clause to sum up this really wildly heterogeneous population. I mean, people who've been here yesterday, 30 years to 5 generations, it's hard to say. It's all variable. Yes, in the middle.
Hi, Abias Davis from Center of Concern. Earlier you commented on that Mexican Americans should be recognized as a separate group outside of the absurd American racial.
Not that they should be recognized, that they're increasingly recognizing themselves as not having to fit into the wider.
Given that, and that that the Mexican American identity points to the absurdity of the racial classification system in the U.S. But how do you think about that this recognition of the Mexican American identity outside of the racial classification of America, how is this going to impact racial relations in the U.S. given that it's become so tense and all the antagonism, resentment, the xenophobia that's going on, particularly within minority and immigrant populations?
Well, one of the examples I gave you was the critical testimony to get the government to allow more than one race was a Mexican American. We know that the case in California that led to this California Supreme Court to deeming unconstitutional the anti-miscegenation law was brought by Andrea Pettis, a Mexican American woman who sought to marry her African American boyfriend. Those are two very big examples historically of we're seeing Mexican American politicians try their damnedest to sort of play both sides. From our mayor and the Speaker of the California Assembly, I think we're seeing. I think those are good examples. So if you need more, maybe I can.
I just mean in terms of African Americans or people of African descent have always sort of had an affinity towards Latinos in terms of being able to organize or to feel like that they're advocating on the same sort of minority platform. And I think the further away that like Mexicans or Latinos go away from identifying their minority status with that of African Americans.
Okay.
It brings this tension among African Americans.
Right. Well, where most Mexicans are in the country, they're not minorities anymore, and that's really the shift. And the question is, in our mind's eye, right? We see Black Latino. That's always a favorite clause of the New York Times. Blacks and Latinos, period. They're like they all live and get together, and there's 50 of these and 50 of those, and they live in the same neighborhood. But in LA County, they write that story over and over. It's LA County, it's 50% Latino, and it's 9% Black. So they're not going to have similar. There will be times when they're allied, and there will be times when they're not. But let's look at the numbers. Is it to the advantage of Mexican American politicians as they go up the ladder to say we are minorities and we want to be a minority interest? They don't want to be minority interest at all. They want to be majoritarian. The mayor of Los Angeles, who wants to be the governor, doesn't want to be the Latino mayor. Now Latino-ness in this sense is a glass ceiling for him, right? He went into the LA Times and said to the editors, "Can you stop saying Latino every time you mention my name?" He wants to, now it's trying to be treated as an American politician. So this is the beginning of a majoritarian, this I wrote about 10 years ago, a majoritarian sensibility in politics. And you talk to these guys, the Speaker of the California Assembly, the Mayor of Los Angeles, the former Lieutenant Governor, the City Council President of Los Angeles. They're not talking like, they don't have the sort of oppositional circa 1960s politics. They have they're trying to mainstream, frankly. So that may complicate. But again, African American politicians in California are thinking about mainstreaming as well, because as you see the Black population having fewer and fewer concentrations with which to elect, they're realizing they better run in non-Black areas. That may be the future of Black politics in the West.
That goes a little bit to my original question. Of course, there's a very big difference between. I'm going to salvage it because it's a big difference between, in New York you create majority. I mean, Fernando Ferrer runs as the Latino politician with the Black Alliance, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. Yes, sir.
Greg Woodhead, AFL-CIO. You mentioned the role of the Catholic Church in Mexico, and could you comment on the role of the Catholic Church in California in the assimilation process? And is something going on with evangelical movement out of the church to more partisan evangelical by Hispanic population?
I don't know much about the role that the Catholic Church plays in acculturation. I don't imagine it's the same as it had been for other immigrant Catholics. I don't know. I don't think the Catholic Church. I think Catholic Charities has English language classes and naturalization classes, but it's on that sort of prosaic programs level. But I'm not sure. Cardinal Mahoney in Los Angeles is very pro-immigrant rights, and he marches with. But that's immigrant rights. That's not integration. And I'm not so sure that the Catholic Church has played a leading role in getting people to integrate. To tell you the honest truth, I think that. In fact, I wrote a column several years ago saying the Catholic Church really they're in downsizing mode now. We have something like 3 million more Catholic school-age children in Los Angeles County, and something like 20 fewer Catholic elementary schools. So the Catholic Church is actually really falling behind in its ability, in its dedication to. If education is a prime way of integrating and acculturating people, they're really not doing a terribly good job.
On that point, when I was growing up in LA 70 years ago, the
Cardinal McIntyre. Anyway, go on.
Facto Mike, American University. The Catholic Church made sure, at least St. Monica's in Santa Monica, made sure that the Mexicans didn't get in their church, and they weren't in the school either. And I was, to some degree, interested whether you had any experience of that sort, that is complete segregation of the Mexican population in a Catholic community.
I can't speak to that. The segregation of Mexicans is a tricky subject because it seems that one of this amazing economist in the 1930s, Paul Taylor out of Berkeley, did ethnographies of Mexicans throughout the United States, and Imperial Valley, and South Chicago, and Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and they had different experiences in each place. And even when his great classic on Nueces County, Texas, even from one county to the next, Mexicans weren't segregated on the same level on one county or one town to the other. One of the great books on by David Montejano at Berkeley now, The Anglos and Mexicans in the Making of Texas, he breaks it down to different counties and the economies in those counties, and Mexicans were treated better in some. You go to Laredo, Texas, which is one of my favorite places. It's a really screwed up place, but I love it. Then the majority of Hispanics in 1751, they'll tell you that we were never treated as bad as they were down in the Rio Grande Valley, because we had an elite here who could protect us. And they would go down past through, McAllen, and there was no Mexicans and dogs allowed. That didn't happen to the extent in Laredo, because there was an elite. So it's a tricky subject. Mexicans were often treated, and it depends on the numbers. Sometimes when you have more people, you get more Anglos feel more threatened. But at the same time, you may feel more protected yourself, particularly if it's a multi-class structure, when you have an elite or a middle class to protect you. So it's tricky. That's it.
Yes, in the back. And this will be the last question.
Barbara Tenenbaum from Library Commons. It seems to me, I love listening to you talk about LA and California, and you've won there. Okay, we're in the East Coast.
Yeah.
It's Washington, D.C. The battle hasn't started here
Absolutely.
yet.
Yeah.
Can you give me some tips on how we can start?
Oh, Jesus. Which battle is that? I don't know. I'm trying to do my bit, and it's hard. I try to disaggregate. Wrote a book called Mexicans, and yet the first question I get is about Puerto Ricans. It's like, it's hard. This is the biggest immigrant group. Let's disaggregate. Let's talk about, let's logically talk that acculturation exists in America. And, even government, the census, the Department of Finance in the state of California, just a couple of years ago, completely redid its projections. Because again, they were speaking of culture as a constant. So what they did, there was an early baby boom in the early 90s, right? It was essentially sort of pent up. Immigrants had been illegal, were documented in 86, and they were having lots of babies in the early 90s. So the Department of Finance in all its wisdom projected that Mexicans would have all these babies at the same amounts over the next 50 years. And suddenly they reevaluated that and said, hey, wait a second, assimilation happens. So one, I think just bringing back the notion of acculturation helps. And also, I think it would help the tenor of the debate, or maybe not, I don't think anything can calm dogs down at this point, is the notion that integration matters, that we can't just talk about immigration all the time. That's an important subject. My subject is integration. And we have to talk about the fact that foreign-born population in the United States is 12% of the total. It's getting close to the highs of 1880 and 1910 at 15%. And for 40 years, we talked about cultural pluralism and tolerance and multiculturalism. That's all fine and good. We know now that you can celebrate Hanukkah and still be an American. However, now it might be a good time to talk about what we share. And it might be a good time to circle around, again, allowing the fact that you can have an ethnicity and be an American. We have to talk about what it is, our shared civic culture. I guess they passed around here I lauded the citizenship test. The notion that we're encouraging immigrants to embrace what it is that made this country what it is a good thing. We have to talk about, I think, at the very least, we can talk about that we should all be talking on the same page. We all should be thinking about what's best for the future of the United States. And sometimes, pro or con in this debate, it gets that sentiment gets lost.
That's not my question.
You are not very nice.
I'm sorry.
Go again.
If Ken Burns were operating out of California, I swear there would be Latinos in the war.
No, there wouldn't.
Yes, there would.
Oh, Hollywood's so sensitive to Mexicans. Give me a
No,
break.
this is not Hollywood. This is
But Hollywood is in the middle of Los Angeles and there's no Mexicans on TV.
Public television. Public television tries to be sensitive.
Oh, they do not.
But
KCET Los Angeles?
Oh.
How many Mexican Americans do they have on TV? How many Mexican Americans does the LA Times has as editorial board? None. No, even where we're from. The winning is, I let you make your overstatement, winning.
Oh, okay. Well,
But no, give me a break. Hollywood doesn't acknowledge, because remember, they all speak Spanish, because Univision's going around telling everybody speaks Spanish for hundreds of years. So the people who are Mexican American don't have a place to work or to express themselves and get a job because we're all permanent foreigners. So no, it's not that easy. Hollywood's done a horrible job of integrating Latinos into the screen. Great, Eva Longoria. You know, she's a horrible actress, but I love her. You know, that's all we got.
Okay, and on that note, I promise in the future I'll be more of a low-impact moderator. And thank you all for coming.
And if the spirit moves you, buy my book.
Buy the book.
Thanks.